Okay, so Rachna Mishra is an experienced program director who's working for WuXi AppTech. She's passionate about medical science and clinical research. She is a clinician by education and has worked in a variety of phase 1 to phase 4 trials in a wide array of therapeutic indications during the last 15 years. Driven by a work ethic and desire to simplify complex solutions, she strives to provide the best solutions as an emerging leader to her clients and teams. She presently lives in Austin with a husband and 2 boys and loves to travel around the globe. I'm hoping pre-COVID and post-COVID.
Dr. Tada, thank you so much for that sweet introduction. And I just quickly want to introduce myself once again. My name is Dr. Rachna Mishra. I am a project director with WuXi Clinical. I live in Austin, Texas. We are all safe here. Snowbird happened and we survived. So thank you. I love to work and I love to travel. I'm a workaholic. My goal as a leader is to find simple solutions, simplify the situations to the complex problems that we encounter on a daily basis. So I believe we have to continuously be open-minded and just come up with creative solutions in this industry, and that's what I like to do. I quickly want to say that so far I have really enjoyed listening to all the presentations. Craig Lipset, I think your presentation on the clinical ops decentralized trials was fascinating. You covered so many good points. Jay, your presentation on using the data effectively, you just really went through some really good points, and it was engaging and enriching at the same time. Domenico, same for you. It was really wonderful listening to you, and I can't wait to listen to other esteemed professionals on this group. So thank you. So let's go to the next slide. As we have all touched on this, we are in the post-COVID era. Since Jan of 2020, we have adopted to a new way of living. Using masks is a common thing now. We use sanitizers, we practice social distancing. Online schools are common, and we are now all working remotely. Countries were put on lockdowns, and amidst of all of this, yet we have seen almost 100 million COVID plus positive cases around the globe, and about 2.5 million people have lost their lives to this disease. But what doesn't kill us make us stronger. So we emerged stronger as people and as an industry. COVID-19 clinical trials stood center stage in 2020. We saw around 5,000 COVID trials worldwide. In the midst of a global pandemic, mankind had to come together to innovate and develop effective vaccine in an unprecedented, accelerated pace. If you compare this timeline to any other study, it's monumental accomplishment to say the least. This effort has required the inputs of many thousands of amazing people, including scientists and engineers and FDA, regulatory people, and of course our very own research industry. So now we are going to talk about the impact of COVID-19 on the research industry. It just threw me off the loop for a second, so sorry about that. Let's just get back to the slides. As we all know, that we emerged stronger as people and as an industry. We saw about 5,000 clinical trials that were conducted in the midst of global pandemic. We all had to come together to innovate and develop effective vaccines in an unprecedented accelerated pace. If you compare this timeline to any other vaccine ever created, this is monumental accomplishment, which includes, to put it lightly, this effort has required the input of millions of amazing people to including the scientists, FDA, and our very own clinical research industry, the doctors, study coordinators, PIs, and the amazing systems and the softwares that we have been using. Not to forget the participation of clinical research, the participation of normal people in clinical research. And without their support, we couldn't have achieved this great feat. That being said, we definitely saw a massive shift in how the clinical trials were conducted in 2020. These were not the traditional trials. The situations were different. So we had to get creative. Our industry was forced to change and adapt and accelerate because of that. We had a dire situation, and it was imperative that our industry had to think outside of the box and then come up with creative, realistic solutions to conduct trials at a massive international level, trials that were with the fastest startup timelines and turnaround, and then trials that were truly monitored remotely. And we did it. But it wasn't easy. With this big shift, we saw lots of opportunities and many challenges. As you can see on this slide, highlighted some of the opportunities that came along the way. The whole entire world was focused on healthcare. We were going through a pandemic, and clinical research was front and center. We were in the mainstream news. There was absolute rush to find vaccinations for COVID-19. We also saw a different experience from patient perspective, from a site perspective, and from a sponsor and pharmaceutical perspective. In a way, COVID-19 pandemic has allowed a massive acceleration of technology. As Craig had mentioned earlier, we were looking into decentralized trials. It's not a new thing, but it was coming at a very slow pace. And what COVID-19 has done is propelled us into this new age and new era where we were all forced to quickly adapt to the new way of trials, which were more virtual, more patient-centric, and that became the new normal reality. We moved into doing hybrid trials. That was the only way we could support our ongoing studies without disrupting and putting the trial on hold altogether. So I think this massive shift was a result of the dire situations that we were in. And it wasn't easy. I am from an operational background, and I can tell you from the different studies that we were working on at that time, it wasn't easy by any means. We saw enrollment challenges. There were a huge lack of resources at site level, at CRO levels. CRAs could not travel. The SOPs and the systems were not just there yet. There were tremendous issues and concerns and challenges with the clinical supplies and logistics as well. And we'll talk about more of these challenges and then what we did on our studies and just the solutions that we came up with in the coming slides. So as you can see this slide here, we talk about the supply challenges that we faced during last year. It's since the onset of the pandemic, 75% of pharma and biotech companies had faced significant disruptions in their ongoing trials caused by massive lockdowns, social distancing, restricted travels, and then a diminished availability of site and staff personnel at investigator sites. And directly it impacted the clinical trials, ongoing trials, and the drug programs. These challenges were universal, so they were not subjected to one study. Every single study had the same problem. And we really had to come together as a company, combine our experiences, and use effective tools in communication and more realistic approach to tackle these issues. Some of the challenges that really threw us off in the beginning of last year were the logistic and supplies issue. Since there was a huge demand of clinical trial supplies, lab materials, because thousands of COVID trials were upcoming globally, there was a huge shortage. There were production delays. Manufacturing units were shut down in China and India, and the shipments were delayed because there were flights that were canceled. Regulations were very strict, and all of this caused an imbalance. So there was such a huge demand, and the supply was much less comparatively, and that created a big gap in how we were going to manage these trials that were currently ongoing and then provide more lab supplies to these upcoming COVID trials that were also the necessity and where we had to provide support to those trials as well. Not only that, when we spoke with our logistic partners, we realized that lab kits assembling units were also overwhelmed. There was a huge demand. They had limited resources, and time was of big essence. They had to work day and night in multiple shifts, and yet they were lagging behind, and they were failing to support the trials and meeting the timelines. What we did is, in this situation, we just had to get into dialogue. We started reaching out to our logistic partners, to the assembly units, to our sponsors, having those clear communications, readjusting the timelines, and constantly we were prioritizing and reprioritizing. We worked very closely with our sites to see which sites were really ready. What are the timelines? When do they have the staff available? When the countries are going to be open? So again, I think in that situation, because we had limited supply, we really had to prioritize. And operationally, it just made more sense to identify sites, identify exactly where we need these resources to be supplied in which order, so that we can manage the supply part more efficiently and more cost effectively. So that was one of the challenges that we faced throughout, but with constant communication, constantly prioritizing, reprioritizing, keeping all the parties in the loop, and working closely with the logistic company and the customs and the shipping companies, we were able to, we actually emerged successfully, and we handled it in much more efficient, we handled the whole issue in a more efficient manner. The next slide here talks about the enrollment challenges. As Craig had mentioned earlier in his presentation, there were so many trials that were suspended because of enrollment issues. This is a graphical representation here where we see that 67% of disrupted trials were due to suspension of enrollment, followed by a delayed start of planned trials at 18.4%, and then slow enrollment at 14% trials. So this was a real challenge. We were not able to get the patients. We could not do the startup in the given timeline because of all the lockdowns. Sites were closed for more than a couple of months, with zero or very limited staff. Whatever staff was available was getting assigned to the COVID studies because they were taking precedence over other trials. Sponsors were demotivated, and many of them decided to put the trials on hold for time being. So all of those real challenges were real disruptions, and it forced us to rethink and reevaluate on how we are going to conduct these trials going forward. What is the best way to move forward? How we can get the patient engagement again. And I think this is the time when the industry was evolving. We saw a lot of engagement from the sites. They were figuring out on their ends what they can do to support these trials and support the patients. Some of these sites were already using advanced technology where they were easily able to adapt to telemedicine and video conferencing with their patients. And the other sites were also quick to catch up. So I think technology-wise, many of the sites were willing to take that step where they were willing to invest into their technology so that it becomes more patient-friendly. And we were able to connect with the sites and provide them the resource and the support on how best they can reach out to the patients, and we can continue to support them, and at the same time increase site engagement at different levels, increase patient engagement with the study, etc. Let me just go to the next next slide to explain it more. With all of these challenges that we faced on our trials, I firmly believe that challenges and necessities lead to changes and innovation. So we had no other choice but to accept the situation and then accelerate into the new era of clinical research. The whole approach had to be patient-centric approach. And how did we do that is using more digital health technologies, and using more virtual trials, may it be hybrid trials or decentralized trials. The traditional method was not going to work in these new times, so we had to change our approach. During COVID-19 pandemic, it forced the clinical trial industry to accept and accelerate the use of digital technology to alleviate disruptions and mitigate risks caused by the spread of the virus. Today, monitoring of the steps or sleep activity levels is almost as commonplace as checking the news. Smartphone tracking is gaining popularity as contract tracing tools for COVID-19. Video conferencing is increasingly replacing in-person meetings and physician visits. So it is true that even on some clinical trials, we were already using these technologies before the emergence of the pandemic. However, because of the pandemic and current disruptions, sponsors, clinicians, and regulators are now fully embracing the technology, and we are embracing this new patient-centric approach on how we can keep patient first and take the trials to the patients. The next slide is very simple, and it kind of really depicts how the patient-centric virtual trials are going to empower our patients, which in turn, leads to better enrollment. So what we see here is that there is a gradual shift from patients being more informed and patient being regarded as the investors. They are now the key stakeholders of the process. This, together with expansion of information technology, is really accelerating the evolution of clinical trials. Now that patients are able to have more home care options, remote monitoring, visit to sites are minimal, and the clinic visits will be reduced, further accelerating the adoption of virtual trial mode. So we will see this trend moving forward as well, even after the pandemic, that more and more trials will be either hybrid trials or decentralized virtual trials. Virtual trials also optimize the allocation of resources in the hospital and clinics to better manage patients with current infections and any other essential medical services. Empowering patient makes it easier for them to participate in the trials from home. For successful clinical trials, we must increase patient engagements through the use of technology, making the information easily accessible, using different apps and digital tools to capture data, direct data, and thus we can move from a patient-centric to a patient-driven clinical trials in future. In this next slide, I have tried to simply show a process flow of how we can embrace technology at each and every step, beginning with telemedicine. So we are seeing more and more studies now will be happening at home, and with the help of research nurses and new technologies. Patients are now able to continue being part of clinical trial, even if they are not able to attend the hospital or go to a testing site. A lot of consents will be gathered remotely. It is helping patients to still be a part of trial without having to physically go to the hospitals. A lot of the trials that are currently moving on are moving into a fully digital experience. Of course, not every trial can be decentralized, not every trial can be hybrid, but we have to optimize the way we are doing the trials. From the traditional approach, we have to move into a more of hybrid or decentralized approach. So if somebody had told us 6 months ago or 2 years ago that at this point we wouldn't have believed it. But now we have seen this massive transformation in a way that clinical trials are conducted, and how patients are responding positively to these new approach. They want to be a part of trial, they want to be a part of research, and they are willing to explore different options that were not available to them a year ago or so, or they were difficult to implement at that point. And the same pattern has been seen at the sites as well. Now they are open for remote monitoring. They are ready to invest in new technologies, which makes sure that the patients are safe in their home environment, and yet they can continue to be a part of trial. This last slide is simply the motto of my everyday life, is to simplify, change, and adapt. As an industry in this given time, we really have to take this approach, more patient-centric approach, more patient-driven approach, empower and engage the subjects, making trials more virtual, decentralized, and hybrid, and using the technology to our advantage. On a general level, we can say that clinical trials are more available to a wider population now. Access to clinical trials is being improved, with groups focusing on patient education, allowing patients to understand what and how they can contribute. We must look at the future of clinical trials and how new technologies are shaping the design of the new trials, how we are collecting data, as Jay mentioned very effectively and clearly in his presentation. And that's the way to move forward. What we are seeing on the horizon is an increase in decentralized trials with global access, trials that are fully managed at home or in a remote environment with use of technology. But we also expect to see studies becoming more global, more diverse, more inclusive, ensuring that minorities and the diverse population groups are now actively included and then fully integrated into the clinical trial process. So my belief is that in this new era, we will bridge the gap between the clinical trials and the patients, and this is going to be the new way to move forward. With that, I end my presentations and I'm open for questions.
Great. Well, thank you. Thank you, Rasha. That was really terrific. There was one question from one of the participants asking if your slide deck will be provided to participants.
Sure thing. I can absolutely do that.
Yep. And then, one question I had was, were there differences globally in terms of how quickly they were able to adapt to a more remote or digital environment than others? I mean, if you could just sort of comment on some areas that were better as opposed to some that were much slower.
Absolutely, Dr. Tada. I must say that I was surprised. As a CRO, we always underestimate the power of our sites. And during the pandemic time, we initially struggled with the thought, how are the sites going to catch up? Are they ready to have these new technologies in place? How soon they can adapt? But it was a very pleasant surprise. Our sites were really working and willing to work with us hand in hand. They were using good amount of softwares already, and they had systems in place. Many of the sites, I would say in United States, it was more easier. So was in Europe. I was speaking to some of our partners in Europe, and they told me that they already had nurses going to the patients' homes. And on many studies, they were actually using virtual trials already. Being smaller countries, it was easier for them to put and implement that practice. And they were doing it for many months, even before the pandemic. So I would say that overall, globally, of course, sites in US and in Europe, Western Europe, we saw that these sites were more prepared. But I was pleasantly surprised to see that sites in APAC, even Eastern Europe, they were very quick to adapt. Within no time, they were able to meet the expectations, the guidance that we were setting out, and we did not see much of a lag or delay at all. The major problems we did see was just because of the country lockdowns. It was difficult for them to be available, and then it was just difficult for them to reach out to the patients amidst of the initial few months. But I think everyone worked really hard, and I think it was the desire to continue to participate, to continue to be a part of this new evolution. And basically, there wasn't much of choice, I would say that. Like sometimes when you don't have a choice, what you do is just do the best you can do and move forward. And that's exactly what happened. So in a way, I think for our industry, this is going to be historical, because where we are today, without the pandemic, it would take us another 5 to 10 years. But because of this pandemic, everyone was pushed and shoved to make these decisions and adapt to the new way of working very quickly. And they did not have much of a choice. And to my surprise, we are succeeding globally.
No,
Thank
I
you.
agree with you. This is a good push that we needed. Again, thank you very much for your time and your presentation. And Sam, I think we'll move on to the next room. Is that right?
Yes, and thank you again, Rachna. And if you are interested in receiving her slide deck, you can email me and my team. So we'll be going on to the next talk.